Welcome everybody to the Oregon State University Pro PDC. This is our second office hour for the winter and spring 2022 course. Today we're going to be answering a few questions from folks, as well as we'll be taking a look at the upcoming assignment, specifically the base map, a couple of tips and tricks about base maps, and just generally reduce the anxiety around base maps because they need not be so complex. As Jude Hobbs, a colleague of mine, we're offering a hedgerow course right now, and so much of that first iteration of that base map is just simplicity, just trying to get information down on the map, and then over time you can build rendering skills, or you can guild or connect with or contract out rendering. It's something that I've done for a number of years. Every once in a while I'll have the time and the ability to put everything I want into a base map, but it's a lot of time in terms of rendering. So really want to keep that in mind as we go forward here. So I'm going to pull up our questions. Okay. Awesome. Great. So I had a question from, now did I mispronounce your name in the feedback? I want to know, or how do we say your name appropriately?
Diane.
Diane. Okay.
Yes.
I was close. It was very close.
Yeah, it's very close to Diane.
Diane. Wonderful.
Diane.
So thank you so much. And I totally hear that sometimes English is an issue. So thanks for asking. And whenever there's an issue, just ask. I'll try and be more aware of that when I'm giving the video feedback. So the database is called the Natural Capital Plant Database. Access is on assignment 19 in the Google Slides, which I'll take a look at, and it is an international database. So if we go down to assignment 19, this has been a phenomenal asset from Dan Housley and Paula Westmoreland. They put this together, and it's user submitted, but it's also verified. This is something I really appreciate about this. In permaculture, we call them guilds. They call them polycultures, plants that work out and work well together. It's going to take a moment here for things to load. Here we go. So 19. So I think it's the first or the second slide. There it is. So please see the Natural Capital Database for plant research. And yeah, so basically this is the whole database, and it's a phenomenal database. Brings up Natural Capital Plant Database. One of the things that's fantastic about this is that it's got the ability to search by any number of iterations. So if you're just searching for plants, you can search. Oh, I've got to log in. If you're searching for plants, you can search by any number of criteria. And so if we're searching for, let's say, your biome or your hardiness zone or your soil type, all of that is included here. I'm just gonna, there we go. So we can go by family, plant type, zone. So that would be the USDA plant hardiness zone, or you would take a look at that for Portugal or Spain if you were searching internationally. Everything is in, you can switch it to use metric units. It's automatically put into imperial. You can go by sun requirements, soil types, tolerances, animal resistance, growth type, and root type. So really a high amount of detail. And then ecological functions, a number of different functions that we have within our plants, and also human uses. So this is a great resource for anybody who is looking to do a plant search. And the other thing you can do is, I think in the level that you have access to, when you submit a research or search, it comes back as a full list, and you can download as a CSV file. So it's a great resource to have, and really lucky that Dan and Paula put so much effort into it. So there's that one, and it is international. Diane, and possible, I'd really like to see an example of the previous container garden design that you mentioned. Yeah, I will look for it. I have to think back. I think it was 2 or 3 years ago. It was a German who was living in London and had done a phenomenal job. So I'll take a bit of time and look for that for you. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you very much.
You're most welcome. Great. Stephen, I recently got a new drain field installed, septic, since the old one wasn't draining properly. Any restrictions on what we can grow there? The new field will be covered in flowers. But the old one may still have a good amount of human stew for a while. So I have some pretty hard and fast rules about septic. Anything to do with piping has a lot of embedded infrastructure cost. And that embedded infrastructure, if it fails, is quite a big job. So when it comes to septic, I usually on top of, and usually in terms of the plume that will come down from it, depending on if it's on slope or depending on the soil type, there's a lot that goes into septic design. I will only do pollinators, and I will only do self-seeding annuals or perennial herbaceous. I don't necessarily want to go woody. The roots can get into pipes and can restrict flow, and then we have an issue upstream, so to speak. So I tend to only keep it as pollinators. In terms of the old septic, is there any reason whatsoever that in the future you may want to reuse that system, Stephen?
No.
Okay.
Great question. No, right now it wasn't draining properly, and we've got one with a pump further out. It's just gonna, dry out and then not get used anymore.
Awesome. So depending on where it is in the property, and feel free to note it on your base map, and depending on what the objectives are, which we'll get into the client survey, I would be more than willing, if it were me, to put in berry plants. And the reason why I would do berry over trees, you could, but there's a lot of nutrition in those old septic fields, and it'll quickly turn into berries, and quickly in terms of short order, in terms of we'll be able to connect with those. And most of the research that we have says that anything that has a vegetative meristem, anything that has a stem in between the contact with the soil and the berry that we'll eat, will take up and hold anything we might be worried about. So in humans, especially humans in the 21st century, we're not just worried about some of the heavy metals we hold and the chemicals we hold, but a lot of the pharmaceuticals. So when you get into wastewater treatment, I did a little bit of work with a wastewater treatment plant in Edmonton. It was amazing the level of estrogen due to birth control pills, the amount of caffeine, and the amount of SSRIs that were in the water. So all of those from the research that we know of to date will be taken up in a woody vegetative stem and will not transfer to berry. I would never plant leafy crops. I would never plant lettuce on that. It's just, for me, it's it's just a question of how much do you transfer. But berries for me are that in between, in terms of I will get the produce quickly, plus I'll be able to actively use all of that nutrition. And I'd probably put trees on there as well, but I would be focusing on berries first and foremost, and probably working in a polyculture, respective of the slope and respective of access, and try and use that up as best as I can. Does that make sense?
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah, absolutely.
No worries. Concerns about growing next to the road. I mentioned contamination in my SWAT, and I've been thinking about exhaust and even stuff like old leaded gasoline. Maybe I'm an alarmist. No, it's I think a lot of us have those thoughts, and they're good thoughts to have. I think the more we become conscientious of the fact that we have chemicals in mother's milk, plus in both poles that are human made, we are living in a rather toxic environment, and reducing the amount of toxicity and just increasing the potential lack of that we might have is important. The studies and my own experience of growing in urban centers is I tend, again, not to put big leafy greens right beside the road that I'm thinking of eating. The Helianthus family is really good at uptaking heavy metals and remediation. These are things like sunflower and Jerusalem artichoke, but they're bioaccumulators. So this is not something that we'd want to eat afterwards, because they are bioaccumulators, and they are either in direct contact with the soil, or they are herbaceous, and so the transport of heavy metals and toxicity is actually quite high. So I wouldn't be growing my lettuce directly on the road, nor would I be growing my lettuce the direction that the exhaust face of the car when it's in the driveway. But in urban centers, I've grown a lot of veg, a lot of fruit, a lot of squash, 4 or 5 feet back from the road. Never seen any issues with it. I've never gone to the extent of actually testing it. There's a couple of great laboratories that you could, but generally the studies that I had looked into years ago, they were all saying that it's pretty negligible, unless, as I said here, you're directly beside a highway, and the fuel that might be coming by you may not be from a state or a province that has the same regulatory authority, or somebody somewhere has still access to something like problematic fuel. So generally, if it's an urban center, I stay back from that. And if it's a highway or a highway situation, I tend to go mostly with woody perennials that have some sort of stem that helps to interrupt what might be falling on them. The bigger issue we have actually is when we get into some of the more toxic rain and acid rain, and some of the heavy metals that come out of rain when living in urban settings. So that's become more and more of an issue, to the point to where I've got some friends who are living in LA who only grow in under plastic, just because the amount of toxicity that can come out from the rain and from the air is so high that they're not interested in it. So if it were I, that's what I would do. Does that answer the question? Any clarifications on that for you?
It does. It does. So I'm right next to a state highway. So not as busy as like an interstate, but a state highway. So it's pretty busy. So I think I'll take your advice and grow some stuff, and then probably get it tested just to see. Because it can't hurt. Worst case, I find out that everything is fine, and I contribute to the knowledge of the group.
Totally. Yeah. And especially if you become and I think a lot of us do this, we become centers of information for others. And this is one of the reasons why I think grassroots conversations like permaculture have done so well. And for some people that gets frustrating, because Bill Mollison, the co-creator of permaculture, stepped back from policing everyone. I think in the 80s, he was running a school, and he was giving everyone permission to use the permaculture as a word after you took a PDC, but then he started a school, and he was stamping people and all the rest of it. And he just stepped back. He said, this is going to be a grassroots organization that comes from the bottom up. And in some ways, and I would say in most ways, it's positive in that way. We get lots of variation. We get lots of biomimicry. Nature is always diversity, infinite diversity and infinite combination. And similarly, when you get into permaculture, you have to think about permaculture as a lowercase p permaculture. There's no uppercase P, because you're going to find people all over the world that will use different, even different prime directive, even different ethics. So when we become these little islands of information, as you will, and we start to fly our flag and say, hey, this is what I'm doing, we become these little repositories of informations. And this is the true decentralization, and in many ways decolonization of growing, of life, of being. I work with this incredible indigenous off-grid farmer, and she talks at length about how the lack of ancestral food is a form of colonization, and within that colonization, we are forced to think outside of what is naturally around us. And so when you go out and test your food, and you go out and bring that information back, you're decentralizing information, and you're creating local context. So I love that. And yeah, pretty fantastic. Have you seen any creative ways to include a driveway into designs? We get snow, so it had to be shovelable. So I'm confused about this one.
Yeah, I can give you some more. Yeah, I can give you a little more context. So the driveway's got to get done at some point. It's starting to crumble and fall apart. Now that I'm thinking about throwing new asphalt on it, I'm thinking, what other options sort of have you seen, just to pick your brain about like what can be sort of interesting to kind of contribute to an overall design, as opposed to just, pavers or asphalt or whatever.
Gotcha.
That was sort of the question.
Oh, I gotcha. Okay.
Work's got to get done. Money's got to get spent. So
totally. So there's a couple of things. I think first and foremost, depending on what you choose for a surface, if you choose an impermeable surface, consider grading it in such a way that, one, it doesn't affect infrastructure. So it doesn't put all that water that falls upon that section into infrastructure. So away from the house, away from buildings, away from utilities, whatever you can, make sure that that water goes into productive use. And this is important for everybody when we get into the water design portion of the course. Always plan for overflow. We have a very interesting way of looking at water due to the fact that we've been so isolated and we have a low ecological literacy. Is, we think about getting the rain barrel and it fills up and then our mind stops. There's no sense that, oh, wait a second, the rain that comes from the sky when we finally get to our calculations on the water assignment are massive, right? You've got a meter by a meter squared, 1 millimeter of rain is 1 liter. That's an incredible amount of rain that falls on just a meter by meter, a couple of feet. So when you think of that, if you can do it in such a way, one, that the driveway has a bit of a crown to it, so it crowns in the center, as most roads should, and generally it moves away from the house, and then thinking about and potentially calculating, okay, if that water then courses to the sides, what then do I want to grow there, or how then do I want to channelize that water? How do I want to use that water in a way that makes sense? And around vehicles, again, you may want to be working at pollinators, or you may want to be working with some vegetative, some woody vegetative plants that are productive, but potentially a little farther back. That's one thought. The other thought is, yes, you can do permeable pavers. There's a couple of issues with permeable pavers. They always grow grass. So I've seen and worked with civil engineers who have been at the long-standing challenge of making sure that permeable pavers don't grow something that they then have to maintain, and always a challenge. So some of them have gone to some of the more hardy creeping times and things like that, in between the diamonds or whatever the shaping is of the permeable pavers. But generally in that water then sinks into the ground, which I think is fine. But when you're in an urban area, I'm always considerate that, well, if we do have that surface, why don't we direct that surface to someplace else? So I look at it as potential water capture and potential water for the site. And that's how I normally think about it. I haven't found a good permeable paver system that I really like. Other way to do it is just to create 2 strips. So just 2 strips for the wheels. That's usually, I think it's like 3.5 times the wheel size, if I remember correctly from the architect I was working with. But again, there's maintenance in between. So it's a question in terms of the client design of, well, how much more maintenance do you want on your site? And what's the return on energy investment? What's the benefit of doing something like that? And I haven't seen the benefit in terms of permeable pavers as opposed to using that directly as water, especially in an urban environment. But if the idea or the aesthetic of permeable pavers and some creeping thyme and a bit of grass helps to beautify an otherwise very urban or stark urban scenario, then yeah, I think that would be fine.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Great questions. Thanks so much for asking them. Good questions all around. Cool, folks. So short on the questions this week, which is totally fine. And just wanted to take a moment to go through the assignments that are coming up. We've got the base map coming, and the base map tends to get people a little excited. And as I said before, so much of this work that we do here is not about necessarily being renderers. This is not a rendering course. This is a course on design. And so we're just trying to get the specifics down, then have those specifics communicated so that way you can start to think about the site in a way that is more connective. So in the base map assignment, and there's been some questions about this already, there is the first 2 slides are one with a horizontal title bar and one with a vertical title bar. Generally, for most sites, you'll find that the horizontal title bar will fit best. You don't have to go with that if you don't want to. I just find that there tends to be so much within the legends and upcoming assignments that if you do take up this space, you're then trying to find space to put your legends. And again, everything has to fit on this slide, right? So this border all the way around is what is the printable area. So anything that comes off of this, we cannot see. So you have to think about a bit of space or layout management. I enjoy a horizontal title bar. It's usually quick and easy and put together. Again, whatever you work with in your base map, you have to make sure that your scale is appropriate. So you can change this and resize this. There are a number of scale tutorials, and there's tutorials for pretty much everything. I've had a few folks reach out for questions that were in the tutorials, and so just make sure to read through and watch through the tutorials before thinking that there's not an answer, because there's usually a lot of detail that's been put into this. I wanted to show you a couple of examples of base maps, from drawn base maps to otherwise. And I wanted to start with the drawn base map because you don't have to pound your head against the keyboard if Google Slides is just not your cup of tea. We don't need to get upset or frustrated about this whatsoever. We've got some really great examples of people who've done great work, and very simple. All we're trying to do is, from an aerial perspective, capture all the information that would otherwise be on your site in a way that communicates a few things. What are the permanent structures? What are the roads, the fences? What are the gates, the doors? What is the roof lines? Where are the downspouts? Where is the spigots, water hose, irrigation lines, irrigation boxes? Where are the utilities, overground, underground? Some of these things you have to call your local municipality for. Sometimes it'll take a few weeks or months for them to come out and line locate them. Eventually, you'll want that information if you're working on design. And then what are the buildings? And then do we have a sense of what each building is? And in this situation, you'll see that Academia has put some structures and a little code. So house, garage, tool shed, ground covers, things like that. You don't have to, in this assignment, start to speciate or put a legend for every single plant. But if you want to, I highly encourage you to. It's a great place to start. The other thing that's important to get into the base map, if you can, is if you have access to contour lines, to include the contour lines onto this base map. If you don't, that's fine. We don't all have access to the same amount of information. You can do what Academia did and just show a few. You don't have to put tons, but just a few water lines to really show where does the water flow on site. So generally, as we're taking a look at our compass rose here, they've switched the compass rose to north being to the right. Generally, I like to keep north up because it is convention, but every once in a while, it just makes sense to put it to the right or a little bit off to the left in the way that the site is. But generally, if you can, keep north up. It does help with your literacy in terms of solar access and starting to view your site from a solar perspective. And then from there, we have a sense that we've got some greenery here, and that's grass, and this is forest floor. Now notice that Academia hasn't left anything white. This is really important. We want to make sure, and you can do it by color, you could do it by some patterning to show what the ground cover is, but we want to know what the ground cover is. If you leave it white, you're basically saying, I don't know what's there, and generally we do. We want to be able to represent the site through this process. So what you'll do is you'll usually do the base map, and she did a base map with a title and a horizontal. You don't have to do both, just one is fine, and whatever one you feel more comfortable with. It works with your sizing. And she gave us a grayscale. Why is the grayscale important? Well, when we get to things like our zones, our microclimates, even some of our soil maps, having a grayscale map allows us to highlight different areas with some opacity of color. So this is a great way of showcasing that. I'm going to show you a few more here. So this was a great map that's currently in process. My zoom function's a little weird right now. Very simply done, easy to read, easy to understand, good color. Went with a very large scale bar, which is fine. It's not necessary, but it gives us a sense of the site. Kind of went with both. Again, you don't have to do both. Somehow it's gotten in people's heads you have to do both. You don't have to. This was great. We got a sense of the satellite overlay with the image, so I can see what they're trying to represent, and I can go back and go, okay, yeah, I'm seeing this here. And notice that there really isn't any white space. They've shown me where there's flat and clear grassy area. They've shown me where there's gravel, flat section, and an embankment. They've been very clear about giving me some area stylings that have shown me what I'm looking at here. This is an urban project, and there's some great things about this base map, and there's some things that are missing. So things I like about this base map, very clean, very clear. I know exactly what's going on here. I don't have to think about anything. I'm looking at this map and I get it. I completely get it. I completely understand it. I know where the deciduous and the coniferous trees are. I know where some of the hedges are. Something that's important is that if there's something in the legend that you do not have on the map, delete it. We don't need to have boulders and rocks and manholes and mulch gardens and things like that that were just stock as an example. You can remove those and just have a bit more space, because there will be more to add in. So this individual left some of those things and it wasn't necessary. We've got some buildings here. Now notice that the building color doesn't match. We really want to make sure that things match here. They did put in the downspouts, which I appreciate. We have our driveways and walkways that was listed, and that's great. We're missing our water spouts here, so we don't know where our water is. We do have a dotted line of above ground power, but I don't know where water comes in. I don't know where sewer goes out. I don't know if there's a telecommunication line. Especially in urban settings, these are all things we really want to know. It's an important piece to come in. And something else that, as I was talking with this student, is we've got a sense of slope on the back, but is this flat? Because we're not using contours in this, it's a nice thing to put a little note in here and say, note, front of property is flat. That'd be a useful piece. There's our base map with aerial. Here's our grayscale. So good example there. Again, a very simple map of a rural site in Libya, in Tripoli, Libya. Generally gives me a sense of all of the areas and all the drawings. Generally lets me know where everything is, but doesn't tell what the ground cover is. So this is one of those pieces where it'd be great to see the ground cover. Be nice to know if there's any downspouts, and if there isn't, a little note that says no downspouts. It'd be really important to know where the gates and the doors are, which currently aren't on here. And if there's any other entranceways or driveways. So there's a couple things here that we're missing. And so this was a feedback piece, and that's one of the reasons why I chose this to show you. This is Crystal. Crystal did a phenomenal job, and I had very little to add to it because there is so much good detail. She put in all the information. I have a good sense of the place and the space. I said that maybe her numbering for her buildings could have been a little smaller, or could have had a background color so it pulled out. But generally, I have a sense of everything on this site. It gives me good information. Again, really easy base map to read, very simple. We have contours in. The contours are labeled and labeled off of the major area we're working on. We have a sense of this pipeline, so there's an easement on this site. We have a sense of what the ground cover is, the field. We have a bit of where the tarp is. The one thing that they added in was wild hillside. So this is more of a wild as opposed to a field. And so that would have been a detail I would have asked for a bit more information. Like, tell me what's in the field, tell me what's in the wild hillside. And if you don't know, it's one of those things you say, I'm currently researching, or I'm trying to do a bit of plant ID. But generally, really good. You can see here that they've gone a little bit off north just to get a little bit more space in here. If they'd gone totally on north, it would be a little bit more at an angle. But again, very straightforward, easy to read, easy to understand. So generally, when we're doing our base maps, we want to include all that information that's permanent currently. We don't want any carts or anything, no vehicles, because of course those are quite temporary. And if there is contour information, that's beautiful to bring in. Any questions about the map? I'm just going to check the chat here. So is there, Saran, I sent my questions to Javan and used the link in the email this morning. Okay.
Javan, I did that too. I think the title of the email or the list is fall of 2021, but then the dates keep going into 22. So I actually put a question in there too under January of 2022, but that's what was in the actual email about this class.
Sorry, so the link to this document wasn't in that email?
Yeah, it's a different document. It says OSU PDC Pro office hours questions fall 2021 instead of winter spring.
Oh, okay, so maybe the other one got listed. Okay, well, let me go pull up those questions and see if we see them there. Oh yeah, there we go. Okay, sorry about that, folks. So Ron, I'm going to take your questions from that document, put them in here. And then Corey, you said you put your questions in there as well?
Yeah, I think I put mine under January 31st because that's when I think this is due. And there was one from Anna also.
Oh, good to know. We'll make sure we've got that taken care of. Okay, so Ron. Okay, yeah, very complete questions. This is great. Okay, I'm just going to share this again. So Saran, page 1 PDC, is it total rainfall and total snowfall? Yes, it is total, but it's the total average. So whatever is coming up as the average currently. And yeah, for somebody who's involved in ecology and weather analysis, I'm sure the period of reporting, generally, as I'm taking a look on the historical weather data that's coming off of Environment Canada, they've got I forget what the ranges are, but I'm using more of the updated ranges only because of the changes of weather and of climate range. And I think the other thing that's really important to keep in mind is that that we're starting with this data, and this data helps to inform our decisions, but it's always being respective to the site itself and to ground truthing what we have in front of us. So I would go with whatever's closest to our current year and whatever has the largest and longest rain. That tends to be, from what I've seen and built upon and started to monitor sites, has been most accurate. Frost-free period from previous year 2021 or average from a number of years. I use my own work record from the past 3 years, which differs significantly from other sources due to our microclimate. Is that acceptable? Totally acceptable. Climate type, my design site is west moist microclimate right on the coastal mountain region of Bay of Fundy. If looking from recent data in the last 5 years, it is yielding maritime. However, data from 2015 and older is yielding continental climate. Method based on meeting 2 or 3 very specific criteria, XYZ of temperature range, precip, and seasonal distribution. Use the more recent data? Yeah, totally. I'm thinking that you can choose one source or the other, but not mix. Yeah, good not to mix, but good to take the most recent. And yeah, keep the apple to apple comparative, with the exception of requiring historical data to find extreme. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and you're probably way more knowledgeable about weather reporting than I am. Mostly I'm using it as a place to start from, and then from there I'm going into site specific observations. Climate, are we required to use the chosen weather station data to fill in the rest of the climate section? Yep. It'll be very different. They come from a more recent online source than the chosen weather station. If not required, this will be straightforward. If yes, no, I would say, use whatever source is most appropriate and feels like it has the the most amount of accuracy to your site. There was a student years ago who took 2 weather stations that were, I think, 50 and 60 kilometers respectively in 2 different directions and blended the 2 with the note that said, this is an assumption, and I will start to be specific about my observations. So here we go. There's your design site. You have Annapolis Royale, Paradise, and Greenwood. And so your question is, seems like I can choose from a few stations, however, they are inland. The climate is generally specifically different, or weather station, but is in the same coastal site. Oh, so this must be a little bit higher up then. Yeah, I would take a look at it and see if it's similar to your current site. If it feels like it's current and accurate to your site, then I would go with that as opposed to something that might have a bit more of a continental influence to it. These are great questions. Thank you so much for them. Does that answer your question, Saron?
Yes, it actually does. Thank you very much. I do have one, just to clarify on one thing, is that I was just scratching my head because there were complete data, like there were like about maybe 9 out of 10 or 8 out of 10 of data I needed from one source, but was missing from another source. So when I went to look for the other two, a different source, it's from a different year. So it's kind of like different, like 2010 and older, and then the other sources 2015, 2000. Like it's just, even when you're comparing the same thing or trying to pull averages up, you know, you're not comparing the same date range. So I was just having that kind of, and maybe it's just me, it just kind of made me think like, you know,
yeah,
maybe like,
No,
I'd be wrong about, you know, assuming it, you know, I just want to know what I'm doing.
Totally. No, it's a good point. And generally, if I cannot find data on a specific data point, I will just take note. Either A, I can't find it, or B, if I find it someplace else, I'll just note the different range. So generally, if I've got that data, it's coming in Canada, it's coming from the historical norms of Environment Canada. And then if there's anything missing, I will go elsewhere and just note, okay, this is outside of the range. And so, you know, take it with a grain of salt. But at the same point, this is baseline data for us to get a sense of generally what's going on in the site. And for the most part, what I'm looking at is, does precip match heat? So if we have precip that drops during a certain range when we're starting to get into our summer temperatures, I know that that's usually what we're designing around. So I'm trying to find gaps. You know, when we think of growing, we can think of water as fuel and the sun as the throttle. And so if the throttle is all the way down, but the tank's empty, we're not going anywhere. If the tanks, if the tank's full, but we have no throttle, we're not going anywhere either. And so when I'm looking at these waves of data, because I usually see them in an XY format, or sometimes the Wikipedia, the American examples tend to be in this Wikipedia graph, which is color coded. I'm generally looking to see, like, where does our moisture connect with our temperature, and then taking a look at wind. So mostly the north of the 49th parallel, our major limiting factor is wind. And the reason for that is that wind can remove 30 to 40% of the energy from both homes and from animals. So if we have animals that are out on pasture and they're in a windswept area, we can expect to lose 30 or 40% of the mass that we were trying to build in them over a season through grazing or otherwise. And similarly with our buildings. So because soil takes so long to get up to temperature up here, I had a really great mentor who grew a food forest in Grand Forks, British Columbia back in the 80s. He took 3 acres of bare horse pasture, turned it into a 7-story food forest that fed a family of 4 and supported 2 businesses. One was a nursery business and the other was an apothecary tincture business. And he has this wonderful piece where he was trying to grow nuts, and there was this secretive guild of nut growers in Wisconsin, and he just wasn't getting the fruiting times that they were. And finally, I think it was after 10 years of buying from them, they gave them his secret, their secret, which was they would take like 1,000 feet of thin irrigation poly, like 1/2 inch or 1/4 inch or whatever they had, and they would staple it to a piece of plywood. They'd put 2 valves on either end. They would charge up that line with water. And in the spring, after the first frost, they would set that line out, and they would basically heat the water before they used it to water the trees. And what it did is that warm water woke up the soil biology early. Because of our temperatures, it takes so long for our soils to get warm enough and for the soil food web to become active. And he basically cut his fruiting times for nuts in half. And experimenting with this over the last 10 years, it works really well. You just have to apply after the last frost of the season. Make sure you're well after the last frost. And sometimes you can extend it in the fall, but the potential for die off from growth that shouldn't be growing at that time is just too high. So I gave up doing it in the fall. It didn't make sense, but in the spring it makes a lot of sense. But generally, how that connects with your question is these are all data points to see where the weak links of your site are, and to design around those weak links.
Totally, because what I was doing, just speaking to the, I was using different data points, different source. So I was trying to check my work or the result, and I used temperature and precipitation times 10, and you get the amount of rainfall, and nothing added up. Everything was just like, numbers were all over the place. So I was just kind of like, is there, when you're using different source and data and crossing them over because of the gaps, and if you try to use calculations to calculate, well, what is the snowfall, precipitation, or the based on those numbers, if they don't make sense, then it's kind of like, I was just kind of like, okay, I'm doing something wrong, because it's like, just, I don't have a lot of confidence in my calculations. So it's kind of like, maybe, so anyhow, that was just interesting that you mentioned about the wind and stuff, because we had also experienced that on our field where we have like crazy wind, just like usually it's 50, 60 on a normal day, like given day. So, and with the mass loss, that was, we experienced that. So, and we didn't know, we're just experimenting. So it's just nice to hear that.
Yeah. And in so many places, this is one of the reasons why I partnered with Jude Hobbs to start offering a hedgerow course. The habit and the process and the history of building good hedgerows is lost. We've just lost it. And some of it was actively destroyed during the land reclamation movement in the UK, where hedges were equated with oppressive power, and this is my land, as opposed to, oh, this is a cool tool and it's not being used in an appropriate way. It's being used as a exclusionary element within a landscape. So, something that you'll really be looking at is building good hedgerows, and we'll get into that a little bit more, and into, I would say, the microclimate assignment is a good time to start asking more questions about hedgerows and shelter belts, and we can start looking at it more in detail.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. All right, Corey, I have a small property and can't find any land contour info on a scale that is useful. My property is very sloped and has drainage issues, so mapping the contour is very important. Is there a way to do this without surveying equipment? Well, it depends on what you mean by surveying equipment. How big is the property? Give me some footage.
Just over 10,000 feet, and it's pretty long and skinny. It's an urban place.
How long?
We have the park behind us. The 170 feet, I think.
Okay.
And then we have a park behind us that's uphill that kind of drains. The soil is really clay, so water flows through. There's also a retaining wall between us and the neighbors.
Okay.
And we think that there is park drainage that goes from the park underneath their property and spits out that wall. So all kinds of interesting water everywhere. And so kind of figuring out the contour the best I can at least figure out, it all trails down our driveway.
Right. Are you the site that had the raised boxes with the trees in them?
Yep.
Okay. Yeah. No, I've got it. So something that I just want everyone to keep in mind is that it's important to link your assignment in this and link directly to the slide that's useful, because this can help with the conversation. Okay. So there's a couple ways to go about this. Some have higher tech solutions and take more time. Higher tech solutions and take low time, more high tech solutions, less time, low tech solutions, more time. There we go. It's that old contractor triangle, right? You can have it fast, you can have it cheap, you can have it quality, and you choose two. So looking at this, there's a couple ways to do this. first and foremost, you've looked through Atlanta, the city of Atlanta's GIS databases. You've contacted the city. You found that nothing exists. Is that correct?
I haven't like contacted the city.
Okay.
Or got that in depth yet. But when
That's
we
first.
get
That's first. So Atlanta GIS, Atlanta topographical map, Atlanta, that's where I start. That gives me a sense if there's any data specific to Atlanta. Then I might go to Georgia and go, okay, is there anything for the state? Has the state produced anything that has the accuracy I need? And for you, what would you say the elevational difference is from the top to the bottom of the property?
Maybe 50 feet.
50 feet. Okay. So hypothetically, you'd be hoping for a foot or 2 foot contours, or 5 would be okay. So if you could find that first and foremost, I would make a concerted effort to exhaust those research opportunities. And after that, if those don't come up with anything, because you're in the city, chances are you can't go to mining or forestry or any of those environmental groups, because sometimes they'll do LiDAR or they'll do topographical information of a site. If you're in the rural setting, but in an urban setting, is that park owned by the city, or is that a conservation park, or do you know the ownership or the maintenance of that site?
It's owned by the city, but there's no real entrance in it. They just had a meeting, or the county. We're technically outside of the city limits of Atlanta.
Okay.
But we're in the county. So, but the county people contacted us that they're putting a new like swing set in there, but there's no signs for the park. It's hard to find if you don't live on our little U-shaped street. So it's kind of an odd little place. The county mows it, but it's pretty. I think if you don't live on our street, you don't know it exists.
Gotcha. So that would be another piece where I would take a look at the county and see if they have any data as well. And Kara put something here. Cal Topo has information for Atlanta, Georgia. So that might be a good piece of information. Thanks for that, Kara. So barring that, so you've done that research and you've really gone through it. And the reason why, because what I'm about to tell you what to do takes time, money, and energy, and you may or may not get it right. So if somebody already has that data, it's so useful. I will be contracted to come and do drone flyovers and bring in RTK total ground station and walk, or sometimes ATV a landscape, and to build these maps, because at a commercial scale, you're looking at something at the order of like $6,000 to $10,000. But if you can save that, then fantastic. The other way I'll do in urban centers is I will do one of two things, which is, and this takes some education and some time, and you'll have to look up Google tutorials on how to figure out some of the elements here. But there's two ways to do this. The first way is if it was a flat gradient, so if it didn't tilt one way or the other, but generally it was just flat all the way down, which I don't think it is if I remember your photos. But for anybody else who has this issue, is I would set up a string line, put on a string level, and run it as far as I could. And then I would take basically heights off that string level, and basically every foot of drop, I would place a marker and then get a sense of how that moved down the slope. The other way to do this is to do it with what's called a storyboard and a site level. And the storyboard and the site level work on a few principles. One is the site level, also called a transit, has a 360-degree swing. And it also has what's called statier points. And the statier points on a storyboard, if you minus the top and the bottom of the statier points, you get the distance from the eyepiece to wherever the storyboard is. So if the tripod's set up here and I'm looking through it, and somebody is over here with the storyboard, not only do I get what the height is relative to me, because the storyboard goes up and down, but the two lines above and below, which if you're looking through the crosshairs, there's a top and a bottom line called statier points, gives me the distance, and I have a compass point. And so what ends up happening is you get an X, a Y, and a Z that basically give you an entire reading of your site. And then from there, you can interpolate, that's the scientific word for guessing, all of the contours. It takes a lot of time. You're going to have to do a lot of research and a lot of Googling to go into more depth of what I just explained in short order. Because again, it takes time and experience to do. But generally what I would do is I would reach out to those people first. If not, there's another way to do this. It's generally open canopy, if I remember correctly. Like there's the house and the backyard and the front yard. There's not trees on it.
No, we've got a couple 100-year oaks.
Right.
So all the satellite info that we find, I don't know why they don't take that in the winter when the leaves are gone, but
so there's a final option you can do. And there may be somebody locally who wants to play in this space, but there's a way of using a third-party drone application. One's called Maps Made Easy, and the other one's called Drone Deploy. And this is something I do as well. And you can normally DJI works seamlessly with them. I don't know about other drones. You'd have to check into their websites. But what they'll do is they'll run a pattern over your landscape. And on an urban site, I can't imagine it would be more than a couple $100 for somebody to come and run this for you. And what they'll do is they'll post-process it through these applications. And with this post-processing, you get what's called a digital elevation model, a DEM. And that DEM can be upwards of 10 to 15 centimeters accurate. And from that, you can then post-process into contours, into slope, into aspect, into water distribution, the whole 9 yards. I work with three GIS specialists who can take that data and they can turn it into a series of maps that's really useful. Especially because in your situation, if I was in your situation in particular, I would get that area around me really well mapped. And then the data from the shuttle radar topographic mission in 2000, which is the data that's used in Google Earth and all the rest of it, but it's inaccurate. Every pixel is 30 meters. So that means if you have elevational differences that are 30 meters or less, which is pretty much the world, it uses a high level of guessing and interpolation. And the z-axis, the vertical axis, is upwards of 15 meters off, and the x and y can be 5 meters off. And this is why I don't do any let's call it less than watershed planning off of Google Earth, because it's just, you have to go in and do it yourself. The last thing you could do, which is probably the easiest thing to do, is you could go out with a bunch of flags and you could just mark contour. So you could take either a water level, and you can look this up. I'm pretty sure Andrew included a couple of videos about either a dumpy level, which is a stationary water level where you have a vessel of water, a tube, and then you have a rod. And basically you're getting a sense of, as you move that rod around, water always is going to find its level. So if that rod goes lower and lower and lower, the water in the pipe will come higher because the rod gets lower. But if that rod was directly besides the volume of water, it would be exactly the same level. And from there, you can actually set contour all the way along the slope. There's a couple other ways to do that. You can use what's called an optic level or a farmer's level, and you can basically look through this level and you can just set point. If a colleague or a friend or a construction company will loan you a laser level, you can set contour across the slope. But basically what you're doing is taking two different colors of flags, setting your first contour, moving down a foot, setting another contour, moving down a foot, setting down another contour, moving down a foot, setting down a contour. And we can do one of two things. We can either, again, take measurements off of 2 points, 2 triangulations. And so if they're 2 corner posts of a fence, and go, okay, so marker 1, flag 1 is 14 feet and 60 feet, then you can come down to scale and you can mark that with a scale ruler or on with a ruler online, and you can get those points and you can mark them out and then draw them out. And then as you get to the next contour, you switch colors in real life, so different flag color, and again you triangulate it. Or you could take a drone flight, again, take a simple photo from above, see if somebody in the neighborhood has a drone that will come and do a quick photo for you. And once that's done, you have all of those and you can put them directly into your base map and then just, draw them out and say, okay, well, these are these markers and these levels. And the only difference there is that you'd have to find a reference either in an online map or something else that told you what one of those points was. So let's say one of those contours interacts with the northwest corner of your house, let's say, and you know from a map online that's whatever 950 feet, and every foot above it is a foot. So that line that interacts with the northwest corner of your house is 950 feet. Next one is 951, 952, 953, and then you'll have a contour set. So there's quite a range there. There's go find somebody who has the data and then just use that to really a high-tech solution that takes a lot of effort and a lot of understanding, to a low-tech solution that takes a lot of effort and a lot of understanding, to that last option, which is just using some kind of level, some kind of site level, and then starting to put on all your flags and then transposing those flags into your base map, either through image from above or from triangulation, getting all those measurements and then scaling them down to your site.
That was super helpful. Thanks.
Yeah, no worries. No worries. It's mapping's a big love of mine, and really enjoy it. So it's a good thing it's only an hour call, or I would have kept going. Awesome. Well, yeah, keep me apprised of what's going on, and if I can help you anymore, let me know. Okay, Anna Hubbard. I cannot attend the meeting today, so here's my question. I've completed the client survey and found that both clients, they are married, have a lot of disagreements and uncertainties. One thing they're certain on is that is not using any of their time to implement and maintain a permaculture garden. They're also apprehensive about hiring a long-term gardener for the property. My question is how to best deal with tough clients that don't want any involvement in the project. Is there a resource I can check out relating to this? Thank you. Thanks, Anna. So you'll be watching this after the fact. One thing they are uncertain on is not using any of their time to implement or maintain a permaculture garden, and they're apprehensive about hiring a long-term gardener. So something I've come to realize is that I am not a genie. My clients don't get 3 wishes. And sometimes, and I try to do this more and more in what's called a good fit call. I wish I'd had this when I started. A good fit call is a 20-minute discovery call that sorry, I got my phone on. That gives people a sense of who I am, what I do, and more importantly, who they are. And I will ask questions like this in my pre-survey before I take them on as clients to see if they're a good fit. I tend to fire clients before they become a problem by not allowing them to hire me. And so if somebody came to me and said, I want this design, but I don't know if I have the time to put it in, fine. I don't know if I have the time to maintain it, fine. And I also don't know if I want to hire somebody to maintain it. Cool. You don't want a garden then. Everything you're telling me in terms of your values and what you're putting into this site is you don't want this, because these systems take energy to maintain. And either you put that time in, or you hire someone to put that time in, or you have a relationship with someone. I work with a number of folks who are interested in this work. They have the financial means to obtain land and to put in systems, but are not skilled or have no interest in keeping those systems up. And so there's some really interesting dynamics where individuals are being asked onto land, long-term arrangements where they are becoming the managers, the farm managers, the farmers. And sometimes they're building equity in a place, which is an interesting exchange, and sometimes just putting in effort. So my advice in terms of dealing with tough clients that don't want any involvement in the project is they're probably not the right clients, which means you may have a very easy assignment in terms of the course, in that the constraints that they've provided you are, we want something super easy to maintain. We don't want any involvement in it. And so you're really just taking a look at super hardy plants, pollinator plants that generally are going to grow to the size that works for them, never come over into pathways or any of that. And there's probably only a few plants that are going in. And so sometimes our implementations are very simple steps that don't have a lot of involvement. And sometimes those steps are not what we, the designer, want to do, but that's not the point of what we do. We're advocates for the land first. We're advocates for our clients' money second. and we're advocates for our clients' wants third. That means I'm working with the land and the inherent characteristics of the land first. And my first stage of working with the client is called a feasibility study. And the reason why it's called a feasibility study is because some things that my clients want are not feasible. And so from my perspective, I go through the process of evaluating their site, evaluating their wants and needs, evaluating the regional context and the regulations, and coming back to them and saying, that's great. You want a campsite. I'm thinking of a site I did a couple years ago. You want a campsite specifically in your region. There's a regulation that you can't make a campsite unless you go through a 3-year evaluation process. So you can have it, but it takes some hoops you have to jump through for your regional district. You can do whatever you want outside of that, but here's the constraints. So constraints are great. And what they're telling you is that they have, and this is what I interpret here, they have some internal dynamics in the relationship which have nothing to do with you, but will affect your work greatly. And you may have to either step back from them as a client or as clients, and you may even want to choose a different design site for course, or you may just want to step back and say, listen, what's something you can both agree on for the site? Do you want a small flower bed? Do you want a small pollinator area? Do you want any garden that you actually produce food from, but the most you're willing to do is clip herbs, and now you're just designing a flower box, or pardon me, a herb box or two. So just remember that the reason why we're here, the reason why we do this work is because the client wants something and we're trying to evaluate it if it's even possible. So hopefully that answers your question. If you want more conversations off of that, happy to share more. But that brings us to the end of the hour. So unless there's any other questions about that or any of the upcoming assignments, we might call it there.
Hey, Javan, if you have time, I have one quick question.
Sure, go ahead.
About this week's assignment. So I'm designing on a 3-acre piece of land, and I'm getting a little stuck at the point of adding vegetation, because at 3 acres, at the scale that we're working with, it's meant to be printed at 11 by 17. If you give it a margin, it's 12 by 18. So at that scale, I'll never be able to show on a single page all of the species that are at the site. So at this point, I'm thinking that the base map may have, like some of the bigger oaks and some of the, really identifiable cedar trees and things like that. And that there may just be sort of a large margin of, where I'm indicating that it's mixed woods. And then at the point at which I'm getting down into like zones or even just segments, that then I would add the species level, or would you try to create a master that's just meant to be printed at a larger? I guess that's where I'm getting a little lost. Like, do I want to have one thing that has everything on it, even if I can't print it at the scale that we're working at, or should I try to do that in segments?
Yeah, great question. Great question. And I think yours is the site that has the forest at the bottom. Is that right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. I know the one. Great question. At this point in the course, I would say a mixed wood that generally has the boundary of that and then has a listing of what the mixed wood species are is fine. If I was, let's say, doing a forestry plan for a site like that, that would be a beginning point, and I would go deeper and deeper into that in terms of selecting, okay, what are the species that we really want to keep? And I would tag those. Those would end up on a map. Mm-hmm. So if I did have some large oaks or some large hardwoods, maybe a conifer or two that were, special, we want to keep those, I would mark those and they would transfer onto a master plan. And then the rest of that area would still be mixed wood, or as we get further into the course, and if you find this out or if you already know it, whatever that forest type is for your ecology, and making sure that's listed and what we're seeing there. And the reason for that, in terms of the flora and fauna blueprint, is it's really important to see, normally, if this is a forest and it's had this time to grow, here's what we would see. Really interesting. Here's what we're not seeing. We're not seeing these species or these subspecies or these shrub species or these ground species. And that's all indication. It's really good indication to understand, okay, what's happened here as an ecology. So for me, in terms of your site and in terms of what I remember from your assignment, I would say a mixed forest, a couple of good key species, if there is a species or two that you're curious about repopulating, that'd be important. But also, and I think I talked a little bit about this in your feedback, you may be looking at thinning into the future just to give you a bit more light penetration and help to either transition the forest into something that's a little bit more savanna. So that way there's a bit more open up space. And the other thing I would start looking at for your site, I'm getting off your question, but it's in my mind, so I'll speak to it, is I'd really start looking into some of the diseases that some of your forests have, because I look at that forest and it seems like it's quite thick. And I'm curious if there isn't some issue there that might be showcasing as pathology or mold or rust or galls or any of the other things that we tend to see in terms of our forest. Because if that's the case, then there is more indication that a thinning would be a really positive thing for that forest. You're on the west or east coast, is that right?
Yes, in North Carolina.
North Carolina, right? Yeah, so humid. Tends to have a lot of humidity, doesn't have a history of fire ecology as much as other places on the continent. Usually disturbance was through animals. So yeah, when you remove the animal pressure, you remove some of the mechanisms that helps with the disturbance and the regeneration of forests. So there may be some of those issues there, and that might be interesting to take a look into.
We definitely have a lot of aphid galls on most of the smaller trees seen.
Gotcha. Yeah. Beautiful forest, by the by. Some of the photos were just stunning. Highly recommend everyone check out each other's assignments. This class in particular has some really dynamic sites and some really interesting approaches, and your level of detail is formidable. And I love it. I love it. So thanks so much. Great question. Yeah, awesome.
I have a similar question about scale.
Yeah, go ahead.
So my site is also a rural property that has expansive acreage. We're talking 439.5 acres total. But the people who live there have asked me to only focus on this 3-acre area that's inside of a fence. So I have the same problem that she just described about trying to get it to fit on a page and still have details in it. So I'm wondering if it, like she said, is it appropriate to maybe cut it into grid, or how do I put that level of detail for the base map when it really isn't going to fit on an 11 by 17 page.
Totally. So a couple things here. If it were my project, and I live on 400 acres, so I know this type of granularity and moving at scale. When we're taking a look at an area like this, the one thing we want to know at scale is how does that larger area plus the larger watershed affect this area in terms of water. So I would be looking for and trying to find topographical maps or watershed maps of the area, just so I can understand how does that water influence this little 3-acre piece, so I understand what's happening upslope. Again, that ecological literacy is such that we just look at the 3 acres and don't think, well, there's a roof above this called a hill or a mountain or a valley. So that can be very useful. And I might think that in your watershed assignment, you'll have probably a big map that kind of shows the whole conversation and how it involves this. But once you get down to the 3-acre, I would say you could have a base map of that 3-acre that gives similar to, is it Adria? Is that how I say it?
It's Adria, like Adrian without the N.
Adria. Okay, thank you. As Adria was talking about, just having a general conversation of the vegetation. So this is a mixed forest, this is a mixed conifer forest, this is a mixed conifer deciduous forest. If you know the type of forest it is for your region, fantastic. Eventually you'll find it within the local ecology assignment. And then from there, getting an idea of the buildings, if there are buildings or fences or pastures or whatever it might be. And then you'll probably be working in detail, which means, okay, there's a little area around the house that we're going to blow up. And so what you'll have is you'll have a small map with a little box that says, this is the detail. And then we have this large area. So this this small legend relates to the detail, and then that detail showcases the specifics of what we're talking about. And when we get to any of the design assignments, like the plant design or the concept design or the final design, there'll be lots of little details. But at the large scale, it might be, oh, this is the orchard, and this is the kitchen garden, and this is some water harvesting. And then when you get into it, now we actually have that blow up. And so when I do this with clients, because I mostly work through Google Earth Pro, I will do blocks of areas. Oh, this is the silva pasture where we have animals and trees that are interactive. And then in the detail drawing, which will be in the report, I'm actually showing layout. I'm showing, okay, well, this is 6 foot on center, this is 3 foot on center, because I've done all the solar analysis. So I know that the trees are not shading each other to the point of being detrimental to each other. And it has the same size that it needs for the machines that are working it, and you can get in for access. So generally, I think up until I would go at the 3 acre level for your zones, for your microclimate, for your soils. At the water, I would probably do a macro of the entire site and then a micro of that site. If there is any infrastructure, if there's any homes or anything like that, I might do a detail of the homes just to see how that might influence the home, because homes and infrastructure are expensive. We do not want them to be negatively influenced by elements on site. So we want them to be protected. The house I'm actually visiting right now has no gutters, has high precip, is in an inland rainforest, and has a wet basement 11 months of the year. And so it's a friend. And so, just visiting, saying hello, but at the same time, I can't help myself. We've already redesigned how the water flow will happen here. So that way that water will go around the house and ideally go into the storm system, because this is an urban environment. But yeah, does that give you a sense of sort of that scale and what you want to work at?
Yeah. I think you've answered my question adequately. Thank you.
Okay, awesome. Thanks. And any other questions that come up, feel free to drop me a line. Happy to do that either in that final slide of the assignments, or if you want to just reach out direct, that's fine as well. Any other questions? Anything else that's pressing? Okay. Well, thanks so much, everyone. It's a pleasure to see everyone's faces. Really excited for this offering of the course. Some great sites. I really recommend taking the time to look at other people's assignments and comment. The highest value I found out of this course is really connecting with your fellow students and with my feedback and starting a conversation. Once you get that conversation going, you can get into a lot of detail. This is a course that's based upon adult learning. And so what you put in is what you get out. We're all the authors of our respective destinies here with this course in particular. And so any question that comes up, feel free to reach out. Now that we have the right, or we found the issue with the questions. Corey, did you check to see if the questions that are in the office hours posting on Canvas, do you know if that goes directly to this, or is that different as well?
I'm not sure. I just I checked your email and then just
Gotcha.
clicked on the link, and without.
I'm just going to take a quick check because I think it is right. I think I put the wrong. Yeah, it is. It is right on that one. So I'll just make sure the next time I put out the email that it's the same. Oh, thanks for all the appreciation, everybody. Yeah, love the very depth of the call. Great answers, great questions. Oh, thanks everybody. That's super nice. Cool. Great. Well, we'll see you in a couple of weeks. Enjoy the course. If you get frustrated, reach out for help. There's going to be frustrations. Just expect it, both with the technology and the information. Be kind to yourself. Be kind when grades are received and there might be a point or two off. It's not an indication of who you are as a person. It's just helping to guide you to the right answer. I think most of us have been traumatized by the schooling system. And so the points, it's kind of like whose line is it anyways? The points don't matter. We're just they're there to help guide you to the right answer, and just have fun. Like really practice and play with an assignment. Play on paper. Please play on paper. It's so much easier than playing with the mouse. Get off the computer for a bit. Print out your site. Grab some tracing paper, pennies on the dollar, and just play. Play with pencil. Play with paper. Get a lot of mileage in drawing your site and playing with ideas. We do this assignment called random assembly when we're teaching in person, where we'll take the elements that a client wants and we'll draw them to scale, and then we'll move them around and we'll see what they might look like. So what happens if the compost pile is in the chicken coop? You get an amazing situation like my colleague, Taylor Crawcheck and Solera Goldwyn made with Hatchet and Seed Contracting, where in an urban environment, they put the compost bin in the chicken coop. So that way the chickens would go through the compost, would churn it, would defecate, and they get their compost in half the time. You know, you get these really interesting combinations. So really just play, have a good time playing, and invite that into your learning. And yeah, really excited to have everyone in the course. And we'll see you in a couple of weeks' time. It sounds like Corey's already doing it. Corey's leader of the pack. Everybody go to Corey's place. Go take a look at his hands. All right, folks, we'll see you next time. Bye now.